Last week we tackled the original Final Fantasy, and I mentioned that while I adored the look of the game and all of the extra features, that ultimately it wasn't quite as complete a package as the Game Boy Advance's Dawn of Souls. While I had some really good comments from people who agreed and disagreed with me, I'm going to repeat what I said last week again here, that ultimately Dawn of Souls is the more complete package because it includes both a remastered version of Final Fantasy I as well as a remastered version of Final Fantasy II, and ultimately it's just a better deal. So with that out of the way, let's jump on into the game itself. As you can see and hear, this is another beautiful remaster of a legacy Final Fantasy game. It looks just fantastic and sounds excellent. No one can really complain about the audio-visual presentation. For me, this is pretty much as good as it gets for Final Fantasy II. Now, I'm not so sure how many of you know this, but Final Fantasy II on the PlayStation Portable was actually released 1 month after Final Fantasy I hit the PSP back in 2007. What's even more surprising is the fact that Square-Enix was actually able to fix some of the issues that were found in the original Final Fantasy, such as the little bit of load time that took place between the random encounters and also when you tried to access the main menu. So that's actually fairly impressive. While the original Final Fantasy will always hold a very special place in my heart, Final Fantasy II is the game that really starts to form the foundation for what Final Fantasy would become years later. And that is a powerhouse franchise that features incredible storylines, lush visuals, and experimental gameplay. Final Fantasy II features all of those things. I already spoke about the visuals, but the storyline is about 100 times better than the one featured in the first game. That's not to say that it was bad in the first game, just that it wasn't as deep and as fleshed out as this one's. So here, there's an evil empire, the 4 protagonists' parents have been killed, so you're essentially playing as a band of orphans, and you're trying to join the ranks of the rebellion to prevent the tyrants from controlling the entire world. And there's way more to it than that. Along the way, you'll be introduced to Cid, Chocobos, and the realization that even though this was called Final Fantasy II, it really isn't a follow-up to the original game. While today we know all of these things, but back when this game was originally released on the Famicom in 1988, having a sequel that had absolutely nothing to do with the original game was quite a risky move. Sure, Metroid 2, Zelda 2, and even the North American version of Super Mario Bros. 2 were all vastly different than the games that preceded them, but Final Fantasy II was a different beast altogether. It really feels like it belongs to an entirely different series of role-playing games. Much like Final Fantasy VIII, the gameplay is completely different than that of the game that came before it. In Final Fantasy II, you do not level your characters. Instead, you level key stats, which are all done by the way of you using said stat. In other words, want to get better at using magic? Well then use it. The more you use black or white magic, the stronger your spells will get and the more MP you'll earn. Want to increase your defense? Let enemies attack you. Want to get better at using an axe? You guessed it, just use the axe over and over again. For fans of the Elder Scrolls, this is most likely going to sound very familiar, and in essence, the two systems are quite similar except for one key difference. You can actually decrease your skill level if you focus too much on one element over another. So if you're a warrior who has a backup black magic or white magic spell, but you virtually never use said spells unless you absolutely need them, then as your weapon-based skills increase, your magic skills will actually decrease. By far the biggest problem with this system is how unbalanced it is. There's a good reason Final Fantasy II is the least played Final Fantasy in the series, and yes, that also has to do with the fact that it's just not as readily available as all the other ones, but for a large part, it has to do with this specific system. If you focus on magical attacks, you'll realize very quickly that you can overtake just about any opponent later on in the game. So then ultimately you start asking yourself, well, why am I even bothering with weapons? I should also warn you that Final Fantasy II has a very punishing random encounter system. Sometimes you'll take one or two steps and get sucked into a battle, so if you're not into random encounters or turn-based RPGs, you'll want to look elsewhere for your entertainment. Ultimately, Final Fantasy II would lead the way to the fantastic Final Fantasy III, which I'll be covering next week. If you like retro RPGs, this is a really unique one to check out, as it quite literally plays completely different than just about everything else out there, in particular for its time. It's unbalanced for sure, but the storyline and incredible production values more than make up for the shortcomings.